Story 1. If you have specific goals you wish to advocate, forming a group in order to advocate those goals makes sense. There is strength in numbers, plus you can pool resources to achieve your aims. So the development of political parties is a fairly logical step when a group of people wants to achieve a specific aim. When the country was first forming, John Adams and other political leaders of the time who agreed with him formed the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson and people who agreed with Jefferson formed the rival Democratic-Republican Party. These two parties contested early elections in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Democrats like to trace their history back to Jefferson's party. As for thinking political parties are bad, George Washington famously delivered a speech decrying the formation of political parties and warned they would threaten our democracy. I guess we should have listened to him. Story 2. The Confederacy actually tried this concept when they seceded. Quickly, two parties unofficially formed: those who supported President Jefferson Davis and those who opposed him. Story 3. People are not informed enough to know the specific policies of dozens, if not hundreds, of individuals. On Election Day, there was a spike in Google searches of people asking if Biden dropped out. That is the level of being uninformed you have to deal with. Story 4. The two-party system is a symptom of the first-past-the-post system. In order to fix this, our best bet is to move to a ranked choice voting system. I personally prefer the idea of single transferable voting. Story 5. The two-party system is an inherent and predictable consequence of our electoral system. You need to overhaul the electoral system to eliminate it. Story 6. To get away from two parties, you have to have ranked choice or instant runoff voting. There is no other way. Story 7. A single elected president given control over the entire executive branch for 4 years creates irresistible incentives for political actors. It is just game theory that you inevitably end up with two stable parties. If you want multiple stable parties, you need a parliamentary system. Story 8. While I think a party system would still naturally arise, I believe that if we focus more on the individualistic characteristics of politicians, there would be less groupthink and more critical thinking. This is not a silver bullet, of course, but it might lead to a few percentage points difference. Story 9. Then, two other broad ideological coalitions occupying both sides of the political spectrum would emerge. Story 10. We did not really choose it. It is something that naturally happens with the first-past-the-post voting system. It is more like an unfortunate product of that kind of voting. Story 11. Game theory suggests that in a first-past-the-post winner-take-all system, you will inevitably, after several iterations, end up with two large coalitions, also known as parties, vying for the controlling middle vote. Nothing changes until we move to a different system. Story 12. Divide so we are all infighting among ourselves. That way we are easier to control. They will never let go of their power peacefully. Story 13. It would immediately turn into a two-party system because our voting system basically mandates that. Story 14. Our country always thinks in black and white. Black hat versus white hat, etc. The typical dichotomy of good versus evil. Light versus dark. Angels versus devils. Religion has negatively impacted us in that regard. A system more like Australia or any parliamentary system would work better for most, but large corporations prefer us at each other's throats. Story 15. We have done this. Once for real, the other a different thing with the same effect. In both cases, the results were bad. The short answer is that if you want your government to focus on policy and to be at least vaguely responsive to its citizens, you need partisan competition. You need there to be an opposition that can say, they are in charge and messing it all up. If you want things to be better, put us in charge and we will do things differently. And who can at least somewhat follow through. The time we had nonpartisanship for real was in Nebraska, whose legislature has been nonpartisan and unicameral since 1934. Lately, the legislature has organized itself effectively as a legislature with a Republican majority, but for a very long time they truly meant their nonpartisanship. The key study here is by Wright and Schaffner from 2002. They took advantage of a survey that many state legislators responded to, where they stated their positions on various issues. Here is how I feel about K-12 education funding. Here is how I feel about abortion, etc. When you put all their responses together, Legislators sort themselves out as liberal, conservative, or somewhere in between. They then compared the positions legislators took with the ways they voted and found that the positions they took simply did not predict how they voted. Liberal legislators did not vote in liberal ways, and conservative legislators did not vote in conservative ways. It was a total failure of representation. If you wanted liberal policies to happen, you could not just vote for the legislator taking multiple liberal positions because they would get to the legislature and vote more or less randomly. The different situation we had with the same effect was the old one-party South. When everyone is a Democrat and the legislature is 90% Democrats, it stops meaning anything. Conservative, Democrat, liberal, Democrat, moderate, Democrat. Referring back to VO, peace be upon him, we can see that this sort of arrangement leads to similar failures as in Nebraska. There are many factions shifting around, many movements led by one charismatic individual, and an inability to really focus on policy. The places where politics worked relatively well were those where they had essentially remade partisan politics inside the Democratic Party by having durable factions that were not organized around one charismatic individual. Story 16, much better. There would still be parties, but all primaries would be open or jungle primaries, and moderation would prevail. Story 17. Do you trust your neighbor to have your best interest at heart? I didn't think so. We don't hate any country as much as we hate each other. Story 18. Too complicated for many Americans, especially right-wing authoritarians. For them, everything is black or white, Coca-Cola or Pepsi, right or wrong, us versus them. Story 19. The way the founders wanted it? We should try that at some point. It sure would be nice to watch the parties die off. They are supposed to represent us, not their party. The name representatives is a clue. Story 20. George Washington warned America not to form political parties in his farewell address, fearing it would result in divided loyalties and charismatic populists exploiting those divisions. It is freely available online. Story 21. People would not know what to do if they had to pick politicians based on their words and not on the color or letter associated with them. Story 22. If we had ranked choice voting, this country would be in a much better place. This way, you could vote for the person you wanted rather than against the other side. It would give more options, open things up for more accurate representation, and help dismantle the two-party system. Story 23. The same groupings would occur, but they would not be public, although everyone would know anyway. The only way to succeed in this is to eliminate gerrymandering. Even then, it would take at least a generation. Story 24. Organization is a natural human effort. New parties would arise even if you specifically outlawed the right to refer to yourself by a group name. Story 25. You can say that any politician can run for a specific goal, but one politician by themselves is fairly powerless. One congressman alone cannot pass the law by themselves. They will need to ally with other congressmen, thus forming a coalition to ensure they have enough votes to pass a law. If multiple politicians have closely similar platforms, they can join hands together to form a party for a long-term alliance. The two-party system basically skips the whole coalition step of other countries that are more parliamentary. However, the two parties are so large that it makes any competition aside from the two main parties unviable. Story 26. I am still convinced political parties were made to make people hate each other. We would listen to each other more and stop calling people names when they express their opinion. I wish there were more people who did not blame a political party for a tragedy, and I wish more people told me about what happened. Story 27. They would self-align into two main corrupt political parties with vaguely similar ideals on either side. Story 28. Even if we had a three-party system, it would work out about the same. Like making America great again is purging normal Republicans. Story 29. If teams are not a factor and people are forced to look at policy, then the objectively better policy wins. The importance of teams only benefits the side with the worst policy. Anyone pushing identity politics is doing so because they know they cannot win on policy. Story 30. Every winner-takes-all system inevitably ends up with about 51% to 49%, randomly fluctuating between two increasingly indistinguishable parties trying to capture more of the middle. In Europe, where often multiple parties together need to have more than 50%, even a 5% party can be significant. If only 45% come from multiple other parties they get along with, imagine two big parties getting 31% and 32% needing to form a coalition with multiple other smaller parties to exceed 50%, just for not wanting to govern together at 63%. Story 31. We cannot have good things that threaten the system of the wealthy. These independent politicians would simply receive payment from the affluent as usual and deceive us to secure our votes, as is customary. Story 32. The two-party system is an inevitable result of first-past-the-post voting. What you are talking about is third-party voters, but because of strategic voting, those third parties are abandoned. There are many videos on the topic. I would love to see a movement toward ranked choice and full popular vote instead of the Electoral College. It would solve a lot of problems that have existed since the inception of this country. Story 33. When the Democratic Party was established by President Martin Van Buren and President Andrew Jackson, it was done intentionally to create a national, non-sectional coalition. There were fears after the Missouri Compromise that a civil war was brewing, so the two men tried to form a national majority based on national issues: low tariffs, limited government funding of improvements, and manifest destiny. Naturally, the anti-Jacksonians opposed these ideas and formed their own national coalition called the Whigs. Therefore, part of your answer is that national parties were formed to prevent regionalism and focus on national issues. It is debatable if this is still the case. Story 34. We started out with no parties. During Washington's second term, the two-party system started to form. Washington even warned about the dangers of parties in his farewell address. The first two parties formed around the issues of states' rights versus a stronger national government. Hamilton and John Adams were the leaders of the Federalists, and Jefferson and Madison were the heads of the Democratic Republicans. Hamilton and Adams couldn't stand one another, and Hamilton utterly destroyed the Federalists in the process of politically annihilating Adams. For about a decade, the Democratic Republicans were the only party. This period was called the Era of Good Feelings. Then the party split into Democrats and Whigs during the era of Andrew Jackson. The Whigs remained vital until the Civil War, when they collapsed, and many former Whigs formed the Republican Party. Lincoln was a former Whig. Story 35. The two-party system originates from our first-past-the-post election system, a concept known as Duverger's law. Because each election involves voting for one person to fill one seat, opinions on issues tend to be diluted and coalesced between two different sides. If a third party begins to gain popularity, you will see one of the two major parties start to adopt diluted versions of their platform to ensure they receive more than 50% of the votes plus one. Story 36. Get rid of politicians entirely so issues can be voted on directly and individually. It made sense to elect a representative to meet at a central place before instant communications became available. Now we can have instant polling on unlimited topics. Having two parties is like having only two types of pizza available. Story 37. The two-party system is a natural end result of the way elections are conducted in the United States. Even ranked choice voting would still align people with parties, only there would be a few more of them. You would have to completely redesign the Constitution to avoid all political parties. Story 38. Person A wants his idea passed, but it takes more than one vote, so he looks for other people who agree with that idea. However, they still do not have enough votes, so they go to Group B, which has its own idea they want passed. Group A votes on Group B's idea, and in exchange, Group B votes on Group A's idea, and a partnership has been born. Story 39. It is not a two-party system. Anyone can run with the right criteria. There are other parties running. The problem is the Electoral College, which makes it so that individual votes do not count. Your district counts. Whoever wins the district gets the votes. Therefore, it is impossible to get votes unless you are one of the main recognized groups. If you look at the last election, you will see that there were other options, but it is pointless for an individual to vote for them as they can never win against the two major parties. It almost happened once in history. Ross Perot had a tremendous following until he dropped out, stating he was receiving death threats from the Central Intelligence Agency. If we implemented a one-person, one-vote system instead of the current arrangement, then other parties would stand a chance. Dividing our votes with the Electoral College made sense when you had to ride a horse or train to deliver a vote to Congress, but we have the internet that can do it in an instant. Could you imagine if Alaska and Hawaii did not see the results before their polls closed for once? Aside from the travel issue, the Electoral College was supposed to protect us against an uneducated population, having been given the power to override the vote count and issue their own decision, although some states passed laws to limit this. Clearly, they failed this time, allowing a felon and an insurrectionist to enter office. Abolishing the Electoral College is the country's next best move. Story 40. If the United States did away with the Democratic and Republican system and politicians ran based on specific goals rather than party ideologies, the political landscape would likely become more diverse and issue-focused. Candidates would need to clearly articulate their platforms and solutions to specific problems, rather than relying on broad party platforms. This could lead to more nuanced and targeted policies, as politicians would be held accountable for their individual promises rather than party agendas. The two-party system in the United States originated due to early disagreements over the role of the federal government and other key issues. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, supported a strong central government, while the Anti-Federalists, led by Thomas Jefferson, advocated for states' rights. These fundamental disagreements laid the groundwork for the two-party system, which was further entrenched by the winner-takes-all electoral system. Story 41. It would be similar, just with different names. Everyone running would eventually form coalitions and groups and probably end up with something similar to what we see now. There might be more viable third parties, perhaps. Story 42. The two-party system does not exist by law. It exists because of mathematics. As long as a person needs 50% of the Electoral College plus one vote, there will always be individuals organizing into two teams. A third team simply acts as a spoiler and sends the decision back to the two teams that control the House of Representatives. Once you have those two teams, they will be playing a competition in every electoral arrangement beneath the presidency, right down to the state offices for positions such as dog catcher in the county offices in every county in the nation. Without the Electoral College, there would be more parties, but there would still be parties because people need to team up with others to do things like voting. Voting is entirely a popularity contest. Story 43. The party systems arose just like every other group. Humans are tribal in nature and naturally form groups in this way, unfortunately. That is how we end up with things like school versus school, state versus state, city versus city, country versus country, and so on. Story 44. Read George Washington's farewell address about parties, that out of parties come despots, that parties thrive on being pro-party, not pro-country. We are seeing that. With technology, we can pursue a direct election of each elected official. Story 45. The two-party system is the result of the first-past-the-post voting system. Any genuine voting system other than first-past-the-post is leagues better. The problems are: 1. At the scale of national general elections, the public just is not capable of understanding or tracking the positions of large numbers of multiple individuals, so those individuals band together to form parties. They are also more likely to gain power by banding together. This happens regardless of the voting system. First past the post drives towards a two-party system over time because of the way it works. 2a. Single-member electorates magnify the effect and cause issues for non-first past the post voting systems as well. Best representation is with multi-member electorates. For example, for representatives chosen per electorate, so strong minor voices get more appropriate representation. If you manage to eradicate the two parties but did not change the United States electoral system, then over time you would end up with two parties again. Story 46. You still would boil down to two parties. Do not call them Republicans and Democrats. Call them for and against, yes or no, up or down, and you start to realize that every vote ends with a majority vote of one or the other. When people start to vote similarly, they consider themselves like-minded and begin to coalesce around each other. Eventually, you are left with two parties. Call them whatever you want. Story 47. We have a party system because we need majorities in a vote to do anything. Have you ever watched a reality show where they vote people out like Survivor or Big Brother? They do not form alliances because it is in the rules or anything. They form alliances because it is how you stay safe and get the votes to go your way. If I want legislation X to pass and 10 people are voting in total, I need 5 of them on my side so we can get 6 votes. However, these people might want legislation Z to pass. I am kind of indifferent on it, so I promise to vote for Z if they vote for X. Bam. Party has formed. Story 48. Parties would arise eventually anyway. The modern party system common across democracies comes from convenience, not ideology, because it is easier to run a campaign and get elected when you have a large group of like-minded people to share the workload. Also, even if you personally do not get elected, being affiliated with a party can still secure you a place in the establishment. There is more security in a party as long as you can connect yourself to a more successful candidate. Losing an election does not mean you are left without options and forced to come up with a plan B. You are simply a part of someone else's mandate. Story 49. That was the way it was in the beginning. The founding fathers warned about political parties and tried to steer us away from them. This is why originally, the president was the person with the most votes and the vice president was the person with the second most votes. If that were still the case, we would have a natural check in place that we are missing now. It would be President Trump and Vice President Harris. Instead, we have President Musk, Mr. Trump, and J.D. Vance. Story 50. Like the founders meant it to be? That would be interesting, but I think it would be even more toxic. I grew up in Europe, and this is very common and makes it much more dysfunctional in my opinion. Picture a political party winning with only 20% of the vote because of the number of parties to pick from. Do you think anything is going to get done? If we had to turn back the clock on how we do things, I would want to see it revert back to when the losing candidate became the vice president. Story 51. We do not have a two-party system. There are many political parties in the United States. We have a two parties are relevant system. It comes from our winner-take-all election process. Countries with parliamentary systems share power whenever one party wins a plurality but not a majority. Thus, a coalition government is formed. The best a minor political party in this country can achieve is to act as a spoiler for one of the other two. Think Jill Stein, Ross Perot, Ralph Nader, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. until he was bought. Story 52. One of the expedients of a party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. George Washington. No sooner than you abolished the existing parties than a cabal of power-hungry office-seekers would create a new alliance of convenience to prevail over their less organized opponents. The two-party system is not a system at all. It is a reflection of the diverse values among our vast country and the self-interested political actors doing their utmost to appeal to those disparate values. There is no rule in the United States Constitution which relegates third parties like the Libertarians or Green Party to ineffectual irrelevance. Rather, it is the Greens and Libertarians themselves who are irrelevant, catering only to a tiny minority of extreme ideological voters and donors. The Democrats and Republicans, for all their faults, are big tent parties who try to encompass a wide range of issues and agendas. In my opinion, however, the dysfunction we are currently experiencing is that the Democrats and Republicans are also hedging too far into the catering to extreme side of politics. Let me be clear, motivated political activists and lobbyists are important to have. Without them, you are left only with an apathetic and generally uninformed electorate. But to be frank, we could use a bit more apathy these days. We could use less partisanship and hyperbole, less political theater, and less slandering of our political interlocutors. We are all Americans, and we all have to live with each other, and most importantly, we need to have some respect for the will of the people, even when it prevails over our own will. The truth is, America is the most diverse country on earth. Every other nation the world over is the homeland of some ethnic group or another, and if they are home to 2 or 3 ethnic groups, it is more than likely that they are at each other's throats. America is shaped not by nationality, not by language or race, but by Enlightenment ideals. At the time of the founding of this country, the European homeland from which most Americans had come was a bitterly disunited place. Most of the immigrants here were either criminals subjected to transportation and indenture or refugees from bloody religious wars. We had Puritans and Quakers, Catholics and Anglicans, and the only way they were going to survive together was with a good measure of live and let live. That is why we have the right to bear arms, because the Huguenots saw themselves disarmed and butchered in the French wars of religion. That is why we have no establishment of religion, because the Church of England would tax nonconformists. Story 53. Well, the United States is the very best example of a society based on individualism. How do you feel that has been working out? Is it a good thing? How does it compare to countries that are fairly united and make decisions based on the collective, such as Sweden and the Nordic countries? Story 54. We have a two-party system because we have a first-past-the-post electoral system, which makes it almost impossible for third parties to win. We have political parties because, in a democratic system, people naturally organize themselves based on shared ideas, values, identities, and policy goals. It is very handy to have an organization to provide financial backing in an electoral campaign so voters hear your messages. Story 55. We would have a lot of ideas being thrown around, many of them counteracting each other and making little progress in real change. Whether you like parties or not, the reason they exist is to have a holistic political vision. The economy, infrastructure, social needs, culture, education, and employment. All of those policies work together and affect each other. Story 56. The two-party system keeps at each other's throats. The Civil War never really ended. The North won the war, but the South won the peace. The French had a revolution. We had a civil war that never truly ended. Story 57. Our system isn't designed with two parties in mind. However, two parties were the most obvious end product. Having two parties is not in any way our problem. Story 58. The two-party system is broken. We were legitimately warned by Washington that political parties would be the downfall of our system, and the only way to really move forward at this point is to switch voting systems to something like an approval or preferential voting system that fully supports the idea of adding as many political parties as we see fit to break the two-party system. As many others have said, they were started for the convenience of labels for politicians to run under, but there are so many subdivisions inside the parties nowadays that we need to just embrace the schism and start 3 to 5 or more political parties to fit the new groups forming. Story 59. With first-past-the-post voting, a two-party system always prevails. If you have 5 or 6 different people with similar beliefs on a ballot, the vote is largely split around those key ideas, with people having preferred secondary initiatives. In a first-past-the-post voting system, anyone who has no vote splitting has an automatic advantage. If 2 people agree for one of them to drop out ahead of the actual election, they will ensure someone with their views has a better chance of winning than someone with opposing views. Story 60. It's unlikely this would exist long before cohesion into a core 2 or 3 groups appeared. Fundraising, crowd engagement, travel and arrangements, and other factors would limit the reach of individual candidates significantly. Additionally, this does not feed the monstrous narrative with which we have had to engage for 60 years. It is not going down without breaking things on the way out. I mean, how are you going to engage in politics without the good old us versus them? Story 61. Even the Greeks had party systems. It is nothing new. Like cliques forming in high school, they still exist. Our problem is we do not hold either side accountable when they do not deliver on the goals they promised. If the consequence is that you do not get re-elected, oh well, the damage is done. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Story 62. This video by CGP Grey is ancient, but it remains the best explanation for the two parties and how it is an inevitable side effect of our first-past-the-post electoral system. Story 63. George Washington warned us against forming parties. They formed anyway because people have the right to freely assemble and because people have more power in groups than individually. It is almost a sociological law of nature. Story 64. We should not have parties and politicians with personal opinions to begin with. Representatives are supposed to be just that, a representative of their district. They should be in touch with their constituents, understand their problems, and represent their interests regardless of their own personal opinions on the matter. This went out the window when Congress limited its own size. We should have a representative for every 50,000 people. Senators represent their state government's interests as a balance against federal power. So what would it look like without parties? What it was intended to be, representative democracy. Story 65, no different, because if you do not rein in the special interests, This partyless system will still be compromised by our lack of spending limits. A billionaire will still find the congressional members who will give him his tax cuts. Story 66. I agree with much of what is being said here. I did not see anyone really talk about our propensity for creating dichotomies, so I will just mention this quick clip of Tim Minchin talking about that before he transitions into the fence. Story 67. Until we implement ranked voting, which would likely not happen because that would take power away from the two ruling parties, any third party would only function as a spoiler party, ensuring that only the second-place party will win. Story 68. We have two parties because we allow unlimited campaign contributions. If campaigns had a set limit on money or airtime they could spend, then we would see more competition of ideas. But in a capitalist system, money is power, so aggregating the most dollars is the most important goal. That means you cannot be dividing your party funds into smaller groups over insignificant differences. All candidates perform better when they align with one major party that has all the funding. Then you end up with another major party that has the capital to oppose it. It is basically monopolistic behavior, but executed in politics. And surprise, surprise, the majority of people dislike the system, yet it persists because all the capital is captured. Story 69. We would end up with two major parties, probably along similar lines as the current ones, because the first-past-the-post system incentivizes this outcome. Story 70. Voters often struggle to understand the actual questions. Political parties exist to provide them the ability to be influenced by one side and vote for whichever party they choose to support. Story 71. Pretty much every poll shows that when you ask people just policy questions, over 60% support the Democratic side. So there is your answer. Story 72. The United States is unique because if you ask about specific policies or ideas, we are actually pretty left of center. Progressive ballot measures typically do well. However, if you just ask about Democrats versus Republicans, the Green New Deal, the border wall and mass deportation, Medicare for all, and so on without breaking down what each entails, then we are a center-right nation. The discrepancy suggests that the right has been very successful at propaganda. If we only voted on policies and not parties, I assume we would be a much more progressive and European-like country. Story 73. If we were a direct democracy and only voted on the ideas, we would be significantly more left than we are now. When the Republican and Democratic Party labels are removed from policies, voters consistently support more progressive policies by significant percentages. Story 74. Actually, the Founding Fathers hated the concept of political parties. Then they all started feuding, taking sides, and the next thing you know. Story 75. Parties are necessary because inevitably a person is elected or not. Bills pass or not. If you need 51% of the vote, then you need 51% of the people to agree on something, and that means finding a willing coalition of voters. That will almost always produce similar candidates because everyone has figured out the same coalition, more or less. Maybe you trade a few gun rights activists for a few school-funding parents, but once there is a winning formula, it sticks until someone finds a new one. You can call those parties whatever you want, but they emerge pretty organically from public opinion. Story 76. It does not matter. Nations have been ruled by greedy, narcissistic, and evil individuals since civilization began. I would argue that this is literally what civilization is: the domination and exploitation of a population by a small number of wealthy and powerful individuals who use hired thugs to beat, imprison, or murder anyone who defies their will. Story 77. We already have this with elected judges. You either are or are not a member of the Heritage Foundation. So you would either be supported by one dark money group or another. Story 78. If we did, it would go back to the same. We do have more parties that do not get voted on, with the third largest being the Libertarian Party, but you do not see much yellow on election maps even if you view it by county. In the end, politicians will group together parties and ideals into one, as that would grab the most votes. Democrats and Republicans are really just two massive parties made up of a lot of different parties. In the end, you could vote for a small party politician who shares your specific views, while there is a politician in a much larger party that shares your view along with a lot of other views that you might be mixed with. However, in the end, you know the candidate is more likely going to be picked. Story 79. the mostly two-party system can work. The problem is that if just one party's voters go bad, the republic dies. This is inherent to republics, really. Our conservative party just got incredibly lazy and careless and let a group within it legalize bribery, ruining both parties in the process. Then people are voting straight ticket reflexively. Even Democrats never reform campaign finance, and most have problems understanding that their preferred reforms are unpassable in any case without campaign reform. Americans are not good enough to run a republic anymore. At all. Not even close. They will never be again, apparently, as it only worsens. Story 80. We are hardwired to pick sides. Even in multi-party systems, like in Poland, coalitions usually clump into two main power blocks. Sure, smaller parties have a voice, but they are mostly playing within that two-team setup. It is like evolution, where everything evolves into crabs, but in a political sense, everything moves sideways into duality. Story 81. With the systems we have for voting, a two-party system would likely unfold anyway. The primary goal of parties is to avoid vote splitting. Here is how it might go. In the first election, 3 legitimate candidates arise as contenders. Candidate 1 and Candidate 2 are quite similar. Both are good, sane candidates, but the third is not well liked and is very different from the other two. Candidate 1 receives 34% of the vote, Candidate 2 receives 29% of the vote, and Candidate 3 receives 37%. Clearly, people prefer a candidate like Candidate 1 or Candidate 2, but Candidate 3 is going to win anyway. Next time around, Candidate 1 and Candidate 2 realize this and say, "Hey, we are pretty similar. How about whoever is winning in the polls by this date, the other drops out?" At this point, you have a de facto primary election and have essentially formed a political party, which is a group of people with similar ideals. You cannot stop this unless you change the way we vote. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.